Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Lois, the graduate assistant for the Center for Indigenous Educational Research at OISE. Thank you for joining us today and for coming to support the Student Speaker Series. So the series will continue throughout the semester, so be sure to keep an eye out for upcoming invites and emails about the series, and you can check back regularly to the Eventbrite page as well. So for some logistics, please kindly keep yourself on mute during Heather's presentation, but feel free to type any questions or comments into the chat throughout the session. At the end, we're going to open up the floor for a question and answer session. This would also be the space when I would normally open with a land acknowledgement, but today Heather has one prepared, so she will be going through that, and I'm looking forward to your talk, Heather. So to introduce Heather, she is a second-year doctoral student at the University of Toronto, studying in the social justice education program, and her research passions center reconciliation and the reclamation of Indigenous ways of knowing in modern day education systems. She is engaged in many related projects at the university, in her home community of Six Nations, and all across Turtle Island. So now, Heather, thank you so much for being here again, and over to you.
Anyawa, and thank you, Lois, for the kind introduction and for welcoming me to this space and for the invitation more broadly. I'll have to admit, I'm a little nervous. I'm just going to put that into the room. A little nervous to get started as I'm seeing the names pop in here. A lot of names that I am familiar with, former professors, current and former classmates, folks who I work with here in my community, as well as family, and so and as well as relations that I have yet to get to know, and looking forward to getting to know you today, and it's exciting. So I'm going to jump in and just feeling really grateful to be in this space and sharing space with you all this afternoon. So thanks for taking some time out of your Thursday to learn and grow with me. So land acknowledgement. So I was actually present yesterday at the Black Faculty in Conversation event held at OISE, virtually of course, and offered a land acknowledgement. And since then I've been reflecting even more so on land acknowledgements. I feel oftentimes when I am asked to deliver a land acknowledgement, I sit back and I reflect on my words and the impact and what it is I am reading or engaging with in my own personal life, and how to make land acknowledgements more meaningful. And so I want to begin by offering my gratitude to the lands that I'm on. But before that, I have a few points about land acknowledgements in general. So one, land acknowledgements are not the destination, right? They are, as they suggest, acknowledgements. They're but a small gesture. And it becomes meaningful when coupled with authentic relationships and informed action. And my kind of angle of reconciliation here today is all about relationship. And so after we give a land acknowledgement, it is not like suddenly all is right in the world, right? Like I have acknowledged that I am on stolen land, or that I have settled here and suddenly everything is okay. Right? It's not going to erase ongoing acts of colonization or violence. But it can cause us to move differently in the world and to relate to land and to one another in a different way. And so I want to make a quick plug here for actually calling on us to engage in the process of writing our own land acknowledgements, of curating our own reflections, and not reading off of a script that someone else's reflections and positionalities are implicated in. Two, acknowledgements can create a broader public awareness or consciousness of the history that has led up to this moment. And lastly, I feel that land acknowledgements support kind of the broader truth and reconciliation efforts. And oftentimes, I feel like when we talk about reconciliation, we ignore that truth part. or we talk about truth in relation to colonization, right? Or we talk about truth from point of contact on, when there is so much truth and genius and knowledge and science and beauty, and I could go on and on and on, that have existed in Indigenous nations since time immemorial. And so as I go to acknowledge the land that I'm on today, I want to share with you a teaching that is related to sweetgrass. So this is a mediocre braided sweetgrass that I did this braid myself. And I had the opportunity this summer to learn from a Cayuga knowledge keeper and seed keeper, Kitty Hill, here at Six Nations. And so what I learned from Kitty about this medicine is that when we are braiding sweetgrass, it is a representation of Mother Earth's braided hair and how we are an extension of Mother Earth. And when braiding sweetgrass, we use 21 strands of sweetgrass. And the first 7 strands represent the 7 generations that have come before us. The second 7 strands represent the 7 sacred teachings: love, respect, humility, courage, wisdom, truth, and honesty. And the last 7 strands represent the 7 generations yet to come. And that's a point I really, really would love for us to hang on to as we dive into this work today, because everything we do, every action and inaction affects the 7 generations yet to come. And so along with these teachings, I'm reminded of another teaching, right? We do not inherit our Mother Earth from our ancestors, but we borrow it from our children. And our world is no longer the same as our world that our ancestors once walked, and our world will not be the same when our great grandchildren are here. And so we have a responsibility to those 7 generations, and that's really how I want to frame this conversation of reconciliation today. And share that I am grateful for these teachings and for these literal grasses that grow here on Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. And for this, I do not work for native-land.ca. I just think it's a really great starting point if you are diving into land acknowledgements and curating and reflecting on your own positionality as it relates to land for the first time. I feel that native-land.ca, well, a little imperfect because it is crowdsourced, is a great place to start. So that's just what you see in the text box here. Okay. So jumping into my positionality, so as was explained earlier in my bio, I am a doctoral student and I am involved in a number of different projects. But the positionality that I want to center for you right now are probably the most important facets of myself. So first, I am a daughter, or the daughter of Deborah and Robert Watts. My mom is Mohawk from Six Nations, and my dad is Mohawk from Tyendinaga. And I'm the granddaughter of Shirley and Gary Smith, and the granddaughter of Evelyn and Robert Watts Sr. I am a mother to 6-year-old Nico, who is in that photo there looking very, I don't want to say anything like too bad. He's a little miserable because we had taken a lot of photos that day. I am an educator. I have taught 3rd grade as well as 5th grade, as well as been in a special education position in New York City and in Rochester, New York, which those experiences very much inform my passion for reconciliation as it relates to education. And the community that I have responsibility to is Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. And the reason I frame it as I am not from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, but the community I have a responsibility to is, you know, as Indigenous people, it is more than just a label, right? I am from here or I locate here. We're thinking a lot more about relationality and responsibility and what it is that we need to almost be guardians of. And so that's kind of why I position it that way, as the community I have responsibility to being Six Nations. So my introduction to reconciliation. So in 2009, I was 19 years old and just a freshman at Syracuse University, really unsure of what it is I was going to be doing with my life. And I had the tremendous honor to travel with a delegation from the Assembly of First Nations, which was made up of the national chief at the time, Phil Fontaine, some of his delegates, leaders from Inuit as well as Métis communities, and a number of elders and residential school survivors. And this delegation was traveling to the Vatican, traveling to Rome to have a private audience with Pope Benedict the, I believe, 16th at the time. And so there were a number of different learning opportunities or kind of realizations, almost awakenings that I had during this trip. So I can remember having learned a little bit about reconciliation in high school and residential schools in high school, and having this chip on my shoulder, I guess, right? And thinking like, oh, like we can't trust non-Indigenous people, or non-Indigenous people are responsible for our trauma. Non-Indigenous people have stolen our land and pushed us onto our reservations. We are in the state that we are in because of those people. And so going into this experience, that was my thinking, right? And the goal, or the intended goal of this experience was, during this private audience, for there to be an exchange and almost an apology, similar to what Stephen Harper offered in the House of Commons. And so the actual phrasing that came from that experience was that the Pope offered an expression of sorrow. So there was not, a very bluntly stated, we acknowledge the Catholic Church's role in the residential school system, travesty, violence, and we apologize for that. That wasn't really the rhetoric. It was more, there's an expression of sorrow, and so, right, I'm sitting there, right, chip on my shoulder. I hear that, and I'm like, that's not the apology, right? Like, a 19-year-old me is sitting there like, that's not the apology. I'm upset, type thing. And what I really needed to take pause with and learn from were from the elders and the knowledge keepers and the survivors in that space. The survivors who were just overcome with emotion and felt that this was the beginning of forgiveness, or that their healing journey had now started. One of the quotes, literally from National Chief at the time, Phil Fontaine, he said, I take your hand, like saying this to the Pope, I take your hand as a symbol of our path or journey to forgiveness. And so I really had to kind of step outside of my head in that moment and sit there and think, these people who I'm so privileged to be here with, right, are survivors of an experience that was meant to kill their spirit, right? I'm sure many of us have heard the phrase, kill the Indian within the child. And in the United States, the phrase was, kill the Indian, save the man, right? And I'm sitting here thinking they have every right to harbor anger, hatred, resentment to those who created these institutions. And yet I'm sitting here, right? And people are saying that this is now kind of what they needed to move into healing or to begin their forgiveness journey. And I'm not sitting here and advocating for that, anyone who goes through trauma needs to then move into forgiveness. But that was just a really, really important kind of revelation or realization for me. And it leads directly kind of into a tension that I feel here in the Academy, which, if you are in the Academy, we love to critique, right? We love to critique. And in social justice education, we really love to critique. And so I can remember being a first semester doctoral student at OISE, sitting in classes where we're talking about reconciliation in relation to residential schools. And, you know, hearing people make jokes about reconciliation, like, oh, reconciliation is a joke, it's not possible. It's just a buzzword, it's a concept that non-Indigenous folks are throwing out there to make themselves feel better about their history, their inherited history. And so I just want to address that at the onset of this, that I have felt a really big tension when it comes to critiquing reconciliation or theorizing about reconciliation in the academy, because when I hear that, I don't just hear it, I feel it at a very deep level, like I have a bodily response to those types of critiques, because what flashes into my mind are the faces of those elders who I had the opportunity to be in community with during that trip, right? Who were saying, this is my journey to forgiveness. This is when my healing can now begin, right? And so we're talking about people who have held so much trauma in their minds, in their hearts, in their spirits, in their bodies for decades, right? And now saying that they feel that they can enter into this journey of forgiveness. And so when I hear, you know, the rhetoric of it's not possible, or people, when they say it, they put it in air quotes and they joke about it. You know, the faces of Phil Fontaine, it flashes into my mind. The face of Chief Bobby Joseph flashes into my mind. And the face of late Elder Peter Kelly or Tapasanaquet flashes into my mind. And how they were all experiencing that that journey as being able to move on and being able to move forward. And so I just want to put that out there, as those are the things that really drive me when it comes to reconciliation. It is imperfect, and it is messy, and it goes in and out of anti-colonial and decolonial work, and I know that, and we're not going to get into that mess right here and now, and I get that, but I just really wanted to put that into the room, that is a tension that I hold as an academic, and also thinking about this personal experience with survivors. So Justice Murray Sinclair, who was a commissioner for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, has stated that reconciliation is not an Aboriginal problem, or we might say nowadays, we might say Indigenous problem. It is a Canadian problem. And I would like to kind of take that sentiment and just substitute problem for opportunity. Now, please, no one run off and tell Justice Murray Sinclair that I'm changing his quote. I feel like I'm just adding on to it because I really understand the sentiment and appreciate it. But reconciliation is an opportunity that involves all of us. And I'm going to take it a step further here and relate it back to treaty, right? Treaties were negotiated, you know, first between, you know, First Nation to First Nation, or Indigenous nation to Indigenous nation. And when non-Indigenous people, you know, began coming to Turtle Island, treaties started to be negotiated between Indigenous nations and non-Indigenous nations, right? Being negotiated on a nation-to-nation level. So Indigenous people being regarded as we are our own nations. And so when thinking about treaty, we, by very virtue of being on these lands, in these territories, whether we, you know, came to Canada yesterday, or we have been on these lands for, you know, a few generations, we are all treaty people, right? We all have this opportunity, and, you know, take it a step further, we all have a responsibility to be involved in reconciliation. And that's not going to look the same for each person, which is what I'm going to get into in just a few moments. Okay. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission defines reconciliation as establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in this country. And in order for that to happen, there has to be an awareness of the past, an acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted, and atonement for the causes and action to change behavior. So I'm not saying this is the definition, I'm saying this is a definition of reconciliation as has been framed by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. what I also want to offer is bringing back Chief Dr. Bobby Joseph, who I've said his name like 3 times already, so you can tell I have a lot of respect for him. But when he talks about what is reconciliation, what is that literal definition, he says it in his language, which I can't repeat because it's not my language, and I'm going to pronounce it incorrectly. But the translation, loose translation to English, is to find peace within. And so, right, we're seeing this sentiment of healing come forward here, and that's the literal translation from his language. And then we also see Dr. Marie Anderson talk about reconciliation as holding each other's hands. And in holding each other's hands, there is no room for harm, right? So talking about that relationality and being together and building strong ties to one another. And both of these elders are involved with Reconciliation Canada. I should just mention that. So what is reconciliation not? Sometimes I'm that type of thinker who can think about it from like the reverse. Okay, so it's not this, so that means it might possibly be this, right? So first off, reconciliation, even though the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, has done a lot of evidence gathering in relation to residential schools, reconciliation is not just about residential schools, right? Residential schools didn't exist in a vacuum, right? Lands dispossession, all occurring, still occurring, right? Really wanting us to be cognizant that colonization, right, is a structure and not an event, right? I'm going to say that again, that colonization is a structure, not an event, right? It is continuously evolving, and we feel the effects of that right now in 2021. So lands dispossession, creating this dependency dynamic between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples is something that is still going on during the quote unquote residential school era, right? And just the continued oppression of Indigenous peoples, right? So reconciliation is not just about residential schools, even though it often is framed in that way. I just want us to be really cognizant of that when we're thinking about this history, it's not like this nice little neat packaging that we can say, oh, residential schools happened during this time frame, and then lands dispossession happened here, and then child welfare crisis happened here. These things are all relying and intertwined on one another and evolving throughout history. Reconciliation is not a trend. It is not a single gesture, as I alluded to earlier. It is not a box to be ticked. It's not about blame. It's not about guilt. It's not about the loss of rights for non-Indigenous Canadians, right? If we're thinking in that way, we're thinking about, privilege and power from a fixed pie, right? That if I give up some of mine, then that means, or if someone else is afforded privilege, if I create room for that, or if I advocate for someone that I am losing in some way. So reconciliation does not think about power and privilege from a fixed pie type mindset. And then lastly, reconciliation is not someone else's responsibility. And I think oftentimes what comes up and what I hear a lot is that, well, the government was responsible for doing X, Y, and Z, so it's the government's responsibility to fix it. And I bring us back to that statement earlier of we are all treaty people, right? We are all treaty people here on these lands. And if anyone knows anything about the Dish with One Spoon treaty, right? Literally, it is a white wampum belt with a purple circle in the middle, right? And in those teachings of that treaty and of that wampum belt, the real messaging there is that we are not going to take more than is needed from that bowl, because we are all sharing one spoon from that bowl, and we are going to protect and guard what the contents of those bowl or that bowl is as well. So lastly here, reconciliation is not something to be done to Indigenous people or on behalf of Indigenous people. I think is a really important point that often gets lost, and something I think that we need to hold at the forefront of our minds, right, is that the rhetoric around Indigenous people has been that Indigenous people are inferior, that Indigenous people are lesser, that Indigenous people have lesser intelligence, or really just this dehumanizing rhetoric, right, around Indigenous people. And when we start to learn more about doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, that can, in those moments where we begin to really center truth and learn about the true history of this country or this nation or these lands, that is the moment where we can pause and think, wow, this whole construction of like the dehumanizing of Indigenous people has been created, right? It is not something that is true. And Indigenous peoples prior to contact had very complex systems of economy and trade and governance and schooling, extremely complex. And so that kind of deficit framing is something that I want us to be really cognizant of. And if we're thinking about how to do reconciliation to Indigenous people instead of with, then we are hanging on to that deficit framing. Okay. So during my first year at OISE, I actually had the opportunity to work with Dr. Stephanie Waterman in thinking about specific Indigenous student units at post-secondary institutions across Canada. So when I say Indigenous student units, I really mean like similar to at OISE, how we have an Indigenous Education Network, right? A hub where Indigenous students are embraced. There was programming around cultural knowledge and really building that community and supporting Indigenous students, as well as Indigenous knowledge. And so my research was to study a bunch of different universities and colleges across Canada and think through, well, how are these places engaging in reconciliation? And so these were some findings, just very loosely, that I engaged with. That there were a number of different symbolic representations of reconciliation. What I mean by symbolic is, I mean naming of rooms after maybe an Indigenous leader who the university's lands are on, or naming a room or a building after a clan or a specific nation. Land acknowledgements falling into that category of symbolism, or putting up statues in memoria, or to really uplift the voice of an Indigenous leader. Now, when thinking about parts of reconciliation or types of reconciliation that felt a little bit more substantive, there were a number of universities that were engaging in creating like Senate committees on reconciliation and wanting to look through policies and procedures across the university and say, all right, well, how might we change things here? And there was nothing in my research at that time that I found that was like system level change, right? And I think this is a little bit where decolonial, anti-colonial work comes in a little bit, right? When we're thinking about system level change, right? Like how can we have change that is outside of this this system? How can we imagine a new system? I'm thinking of Sandy Grande here, right? How can we imagine a new university? I think also, I'm like looking over here on my bookshelf to see if I have the book over here. There's also a text that I read about, constructing a new university, and written by pen name La Paperson, and I think that's actually Yang who wrote that text. And so really, really interesting to think about system level change. And yeah, and where can that happen? And what I will say about this, and I was going to offer this story later on, but I think it makes sense to do it now, is that, right, where might we feel the most impact when we're thinking about impacts in terms of like, well, the number of people we can reach, right? I think my mind immediately goes to systemic, right? Like, oh, systemic change because it's going to be felt everywhere. And what I don't want to happen here is for me to create this hierarchy of like symbolic being on the lower end, because I do think symbolic is important. I do not think it is the only pathway, and we should engage in symbolic reconciliation, and we should be looking for other ways to engage in reconciliation that are a little more substantive, as well as pushing for systemic change. And I think that symbolic reconciliation is an entry point for folks. And it's important to have those entry points, right? We need those entry points to ground us in the work and to make us feel like, okay, yes, I understand what this is. And so I don't necessarily see that there is a hierarchy here. I see them as working interdependently and relying on one another. And here I'm just sharing some different kind of expressions of reconciliation. So here is up in the corner here, this is where you see former National Chief Phil Fontaine with late Elder Peter Kelly or Tabasanaquat with the Pope, right? So that is what I kind of said at the onset, right? This Pope expressing sorrow for abuse at residential schools, right? So that to say, oh, is that systemic or is that substantive? I'm not really sure. I would probably fall more to the symbolic. But then also think about, well, what was the impact of that symbolism, right? I shared with you at the beginning that so many elders from this experience felt like, oh, I can now begin my healing journey, right? That's impact. That's important. A couple of other things here. At STU, this is what I mentioned earlier, there was a committee on Indigenous reconciliation that was established, as well as the Anglican Church of Canada has issued a pretty robust apology about their involvement in residential schools. So not only stating that they had an involvement, but saying that their involvement and complacency and in residential school era, I always get a little taken back when I have to say this, but the exact phrasing from the Archbishop at the time was, we failed you, we failed ourselves, and we failed God. And that's a really, I say that, and while I'm not, someone who is a member of that faith, I feel the impact of those words. And so just wanted to offer that as, there are different types of reconciliation here that we're talking about. All right. Now, jumping into some project work. So this is actually very recent, and I've had the opportunity to actually develop and implement different learning modules around the topic of reconciliation in the environmental sector. So I've been working with adults, which is a change of pace for me. As I shared with you earlier, I'm normally used to working with third graders and fifth graders. So working with adults who have a very technical engineering background has been something that has been a really big shift for me, but a lot of really great learning opportunities. And so in this project, we framed reconciliation as relationship. Okay, and not only relationship between people, but relationship with self, relationship with others, and relationship to land. Because if we're talking about reconciliation in the Indigenous context, we cannot forget land, right? Land is of utmost importance. And there is this quote that rings in my mind from Dr. Martin Cannon, who is my supervisor, that where the land is stolen, emplacement is the most urgent of tasks. And it sticks in my mind because I remember when he said it in a class, he said it 3 times, I think, to really hit home what that point was. And I heard it the first time and I was like, whoa, and it impacted me then. And then the other 2 times I had time to then write it down. But when thinking about reconciliation, right, we are not just thinking about restoring relationship between people, right? We're thinking about healing within ourselves, and how Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities have that agency and have that knowledge and have that genius to engage in that work, in their own communities, I think is something that is important. So in this work, in our identity module, we do a lot of reflection on power and privilege, right? And thinking about our identities and the ways that we're socialized, or identities that we get to choose and identities that are kind of assigned for us, maybe based on how we present ourselves to the world. And thinking about, well, what is our entry point to reconciliation, or what is my positionality, right? What is the circle of impact that I might have as it relates to reconciliation? we also talk a lot in the identity module about that, that construction or that positioning of Indigenous peoples through deficit or through inferiority. So we talk a lot about how did we first come to learn about Indigenous peoples? And you don't know how many times I see across the Mentimeter, like Pocahontas or Disney, or all these really problematic representations of Indigenous peoples. Or for folks who maybe are a little bit newer to Turtle Island, a lot of what I see is about you know, activism as it relates to land rights and water rights, but people are very transparent when they say that but the news, right, has, you know, has had a tendency of portraying water protectors and land defenders as criminals, right? Criminalizing the very people who are out there doing the work to protect land and protect water, like literally the work of putting their bodies on the line, right? For and that not being just for the benefit of Indigenous nations, but the benefit of all of us, right? And protecting Mother Earth. And so in the identity module, we begin to think about those problematic constructions, right? And where did they come from? And how did we get access to those? Oh, maybe it was from my elementary school teacher, and I grew up in this area, which seemed to be very privileged or very homogeneous when it came to the population or the demographics. And so we really get into thinking about and wanting to unpack and dig through our identity. And the goal of that is for folks to realize that reconciliation is not a prescription, right? I can't say, okay, so-and-so, you are, you know, 48 years of age and you are a white male. All right, you know, let me type in that information and then your prescription prints out. This is how you reconcile, right? That is reconciliation is something that calls on us to be very reflective and reflexive in our positionalities and what it is that we are going to do to engage in that work and breathe life into reconciliation. The second part of this is land. So going back to truth, right? Wanting to actually center Indigenous knowledge, right? Indigenous knowledge separate from colonization. So in this module, we engage with stories such as the creation story and learning about Sky Woman. We learn more about braiding sweetgrass. We learn more about teachings of the eagle feather, and elders are leading those teachings in the land module. And so what we are doing there is wanting folks to start thinking about their identity as it relates to the land that they are on, right? How is it that they have interacted with land? How is it that they are grateful or give thanks to land? And one of the teachings that I'll mention very succinctly is when thinking about the creation story and the story of Sky Woman, in that creation story, it is revealed and taught to us that humans are not the pinnacle of creation. So humans are not the pinnacle of creation, and that in fact, we are reliant. We are reliant on all of these other beings, right? Sky Woman would not have been able to dance on Turtle's back, which then formed Turtle Island, without the water animals, without the birds who so graciously guided her down to Earth. And so that is something that comes, a teaching that comes through very strongly in that module that we position in our learning. Oh, am I cutting out?
I can hear you all right, Heather.
It's okay.
Does everyone else hear all right?
Because that would not be atypical. I mean, I am at 6 Nations and our Wi-Fi is spotty. That's in the nicest way I can say it. So some reflections from this project, right, has been, and this is all largely from non-Indigenous peoples, right, positioning reconciliation as healing, as learning, as difficult, as a journey, right? And I'm going to quote Dr. Bobby Joseph again. My goodness, his ears must just be burning as I say his name over and over again. But he was asked one time, what happens when we have achieved reconciliation? And he kind of looked and said, achieved reconciliation? Well, then we reconcile some more, right? It is not a destination. We will not cross a finish line and say we are reconciled. And actually within this environmental industry, I actually have had a lot of problems referring to it as reconciliation training, because I am not going to give someone a certificate that says you have been trained in reconciliation because that is not the goal, right? So I have framed it as reconciliation learning series instead of reconciliation training. And so this is an ongoing journey that is completely personalized to us. And we must be accountable, right? Those treaties that I spoke of earlier call on us to be accountable. Move along here. Okay. Some reflections from the participants is after we did the identity module, we were talking a lot about reconciling worldviews, right? Like, how do we work to harmonize, or how do we realize these moments where there might be tension because, hey, your creation story says this and my creation story says this. How do we reconcile those things? How might we come to a common understanding, or how might we respect those differences? And so in this module, we talked a lot about harmonizing work, as well as realizing that there's moments of tension. And what I wanted to bring here, right, again, is that we each have our own realms and our own positionalities where we can breathe life into reconciliation. And now I'm going to share the story that I actually forgot earlier when I said I was going to share it. It came back to me now. So when thinking of, again, about reconciliation and impact, right? We might think like, oh, macro level reconciliation, right? Like Justin Trudeau or whoever it might be, like engaging in something that's going to like impact all of Canada, right? As like, that needs to be the reconciliation we engage in. And what I might say to that is like, yes, and, right? I've tried to adopt this standpoint of yes, and I'll share with you kind of this story of positioning like macro and micro reconciliation. So my dad has this friend who is about the same age as him. He's in his late 60s. And he and my dad were in Ottawa at some point. I think this was in the last 10 years for the opening of this reconciliation exhibit at a specific museum. And so they're sitting there kind of waiting for the program to start. And he looks over to my dad and he says, I have something really, really big to share with you. And so my dad says, okay, go ahead. And he goes, I told my daughter I love her today. And, you know, my dad's just kind of like, cool, that's great. That's great. Like, that's awesome. And he said, no, Bob, for the first time, I told her that I loved her. She's 32 years old. And for the first time in her life, she has heard me express my love for her. And he says, you know, my grandparents went to residential school. I went to residential school. My parents went to residential school. And never in my life did I ever hear someone tell me they loved me. He said, you know, the folks who were running the residential school sure as hell didn't tell me they loved me. And for me to be able to sit here and see her face light up in a way I've never seen it before, and that hug that we shared right after I said it, I said, I'm going to say it all the time. I'm going to say it all the time. I'm going to let her know that I love her all the time, because that's exactly how I feel about her. And I don't know how I went through 32 years of her life not telling her that every day. That is reconciliation. Is it big macro level federal government reconciliation? No. But that person-to-person relationship and healing is incredibly important and incredibly impactful. In that moment, just think of all the possible intergenerational effects that he broke in that moment, right? That she might then have children of her own one day, and that will be a part of how she expresses her care for them. And so I just share that moment with you because I get chills every time I think about it, or every time I talk about it. And to me, that's reconciliation too. And yeah, so I share that and offer that story to you. Just kind of closing up here, just checking that. Thanks, Verna. So my intended research, and I'm not going to talk about this for too long because, I mean, it's intended, and Dr. Sykes knows this, that the intended research that I was talking about 4 semesters ago is not what I'm talking about now. So this evolves, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But similar to that research that I've done about how are post-secondary institutions engaging in reconciliation, I'm really interested in learning about how K-12 is engaging in reconciliation as it relates to call to action number 62. So specifically, working in consultation and collaboration with survivors, with Indigenous peoples and educators to make age-appropriate curriculum on residential schools, on treaties, on the history of Indigenous people, as well as contemporary contributions in K-12. And so that is something I'm really, really interested in exploring. One, because I just want to like get into schools and know what is going on. And two, because I think what we'll find is that reconciliation, again, isn't a prescription, right? We can't look at a school and say, okay, this Catholic school in this school district has been engaging in reconciliation in this way. So then that means this Catholic school over here should engage in reconciliation in that way. I don't think that will be the findings. I think the findings will be that reconciliation looks like X, and looks like Y, looks like Z, and maybe I should have started earlier in the alphabet so I could keep going, but reconciliation looks like all of these different things, right? And that is kind of like what really drives me here, is that based on your positionality, your context, your community, it's going to look and it's going to evolve in different ways. And as long as we are accountable and we are engaged in the work, we are moving along on the journey. So that's really what I'm interested in pursuing in my intended research. Lastly, I have some reflections for educators. I had to bring it back to education at the end. I think educators engaging in the unlearning and relearning the history of Turtle Island is of utmost importance. Knowing that land acknowledgements are but an entry point. So if we're asking our students to recite land acknowledgements, that have been written by our school board, how do we take that and how do we interrogate that, and how do we make meaningful lessons that will be lasting moments for our students? Including Indigenous voices in our classroom libraries, engaging with Indigenous communities meaningfully. So beyond, Aboriginal Day or Indigenous Peoples Month, right? How do we engage with communities meaningfully? And I would argue also like on their own terms, right? Approaching communities and saying, we really want to ensure that your knowledge and your perspective and your voice is included in our classroom. How might we go about that? And how might we go about establishing that relationship? Teaching Indigenous histories and perspectives outside of holidays and special months. So I kind of already hit on that. Not all Indigenous knowledges or practices are to be experienced. And I think that's been a hard point I've had with some educators in the past, that there was actually, someone just sent me a news article yesterday of something going on in Hamilton school district where I think students were creating wampum belts, like their own wampum belts or something, but there was, it was largely, I think, like, and don't quote me on this, this might be wrong. There was only one article I read about it, but the whole premise there, right, is this appropriation of Indigenous knowledge. And so ensuring that we are not doing that, as well as framing Indigenous peoples as having been here, still here, and existing in the future, right? Talking about Indigenous futurities is something that I am just starting to dive into. And it's beautiful to think about that, to think about our knowledge as evolving, and not just, our knowledge is not just like 1491 and before that. Our knowledge has withstood so much, and it is continuously evolving, and we are learning and reclaiming, and it's really exciting. And lastly, some questions for consideration. We don't have to get into this now, but maybe just something to put in your back pocket, right? Ideally, what does reconciliation look like in our community? Like you asking yourself that, the community you belong to. And what actions can we take as individuals to breathe life into reconciliation? And what I'll say on that last note is I have worked with some educators who say, oh, like, Heather, I did this land acknowledgement and I said the name of the nation wrong, even though I practiced it over and over again, and someone called me out for it. That's okay. It's okay. That's okay for that to happen, right? Acknowledge it and move forward and keep keep it pushing, right? Keep the reconciliation fire within you as you keep moving and you keep growing and you keep learning, right? Indigenous peoples ourselves, we are not experts on this either, right? There is a lot of healing that is needing to happen in our own communities, right? And we are learning from our elders, from our knowledge keepers, from our language holders, how to engage in reconciliation ourselves. So with that, I want to say Nyawagoa, thank you so much for listening to me. I know that it's not necessarily like, you know, master's thesis or dissertation ish research. It's a lot more about experiential and stories, but I really hope, you know, something has landed in a really great way for you, and just Nyawa so much, and thank you for listening and for your time this afternoon. So thank you. And I'll turn it over to Lois.
Great. Thank you, Heather, so much, Nyawe, for your time and for coming to speak about this incredibly important topic, reconciliation. And yeah, I'm definitely sticking with the idea of we are all treaty people. So thank you so much for that. And I guess if anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or to type it into the chat. We have a few more minutes, so please go ahead and do that if you'd like. Oh, I see Danielle has raised her hand.
Hello,
Danielle.
Heather. It's wonderful to hear your thoughts and how this is alive in you. And I wanted to share just a comment and a question to you. So I really, what has landed in me is the breathing life into reconciliation, and the fact that it is a weaving, and that it is not a weaving that is outside of us, but a weaving that's in our relationships. It is relational, and it is in and how we continue to build society from the inside out. And it makes me think about the need to discover how colonialism lives in me, and how it lives in the members of my community, and how it lives in learning spaces, and the need to kind of crack open, you know, connect with those walls and those resistances, and also crack them open so there can be space to talk about, well, what do we want to reconcile? Where do we want to join hands? And what do we want to grow into? And where don't we want to go back to? And I'm wondering about the use of the arts, because of my experience of them, and you know, not my ideas, but my experiences. They have an ability to kind of bypass prefrontal cortex and like get right to our humanness. And at the same time, not wanting to misuse Indigenous art forms and not leave them recklessly into contexts without, you know, proper preparation. I just would be interested in your thoughts as to, in your projects, have you used, you know, music, art, movement, the arts as a way to engage into conversations of facing colonization and engaging with reconciliation?
Hey, that's a really, really great question. Thanks so much, Danielle. So when it comes to the arts, something that we have done in a couple of our projects is when we might be asking an elder or a knowledge keeper, or sometimes it's someone from our youth council as well, to step forward and maybe offer, you know, opening words, invocation, or closing. Oftentimes that will be done through song. And sometimes it's with a song and paired with a water drum or a hand drum or a rattle. And usually an explanation will either precede that or follow that by the knowledge keeper, the youth, or the elder. And you're right, it lands so much more, so much, I guess, in a different way than just words and discussion. And I know for myself, I actually went in this kind of, I'll try and be brief here. I told you I can be long-winded, but I went through this moment when I was living in New York City. So this is before I started teaching, and I was still doing my master's. And I was actually, I could tell that I was like losing like my sense of like Indigenous identity, and like I was trying to distance myself from it. And I remember I stepped into class once, and it was specifically on the topic of incorporating or like culturally relevant pedagogy or something. And I was giving a presentation, and I wanted to introduce myself in Mohawk as I know how, as I always do. And I went to say it, and I said Sego Sebo Cuego, and then the next thing that's supposed to come is my name, and I couldn't remember it. I couldn't remember my name, and in that moment, like it is probably the most shame I have ever felt in my life. And so I started like praying that this would come to me, because in no way did I want to call my mom or text my dad and say, hey, could you tell me what my Mohawk name is again? Could you tell me what my Ojibwe name is again? Like, I'm 21 years old. In no way did I want to do that. And something that helped me, or that I believe that helped me on that journey, is to kind of find my way back to it, is I began kind of returning to music and listening to women's hand drum songs as a way to just bring me back into culture. And I remember the first time I turned on, it was Akwesasne Women Singers, and I turned it on after years of not listening to it, and I cried. So you're so right in the sentiment that arts impact us, our spirits in such a different way. And I think doing that in collaboration with Indigenous artists is something that's of utmost importance, and kind of almost similar to what I was saying earlier about like reflections for educators, right? Letting those artists lead the way and say, I'm really wanting, my students to learn more about this. How can I do that? In partnership with you, in a way that is respectful. And I think folks are really, really, really open to that conversation of, I want to do this. I don't want to appropriate. I don't want to be respectful. What are your thoughts on that? How might we be in partnership to do that? I think that is kind of the best course to address that. Thank you for your question.
Great, Heather. I see some comments as well in the chat if you would like to react to any, and perhaps we have time for one more question if someone wants to ask it now.
Thank you for all the kind comments. I'm turning red. Could also be that I have this really warm sweater on right now. But.
Great. So Heather, I think that unless you would like to say any final words, I just want to thank you so much for coming and speaking today, and invite everyone to say thank you to our speaker, who has been amazing today. Thank you again.
Hey, thank you all again. Thank you for the invitation and the space to think and to process and to engage with you all. And I'm always open and would love to continue a conversation with anyone. So if you're interested in that, I would love that and welcome that wholeheartedly. So thank you, Nyawa, again for the invitation, for being in community, with everyone today.
Wonderful. Have a wonderful afternoon, evening, everyone, depending on wherever you are. Great.
Nyawa, thank you.
Thanks, Heather. That was